Well, why are we doing this? I mean, I mentioned that we've been doing this for a couple of years, and we've been doing it face-to-face. Well, one of the things about face-to-face is that it costs a lot of money. And we don't have a lot of money either in the university or in the SAF. So we're looking to try and be as cost-effective as possible. And the webinar approach seemed to be a pretty good way to try to disseminate information that's relevant to this issue. Forest management is happening everywhere. Fuels treatments can have adverse effects on habitat and wildlife. So, you know, we've got the FRAP report, which was recently published, has got abundant evidence of increased fire frequency, size, and intensity, and predicted further increases in the future. Numerous communities are at risk from wildfire. This is the Angora burn. The coloration here is predicted fire severity before the fire, and actually if you looked at what happened after the fire, it pretty much conformed to what the modeled predicted severity was. What you're looking at here is the red indicates areas susceptible to crown fires, you know, and so we've got large areas of the state which could be subject to stand replacing fires. We've also got lots of places that have already burned, and there's thousands of acres that are in need of treatment, post-fire restoration. We don't want to create more of those, so we're implementing fuels treatments because we expect to have benefits by trying to reduce the wildfire impacts on natural areas and on communities. But we have to have balanced objectives when we're looking at these treatments. We want to not just reduce the risk of wildfire. We want to try to improve forest health and productivity. We want to reduce the risk of disease and insect attack which tends to be associated with stands that are susceptible to wildfire. We want to minimize direct and indirect impacts on wildlife and native plants, and if possible, we want to improve wildlife habitat. So we can have multiple objectives through the vehicle of fuels treatments, because fuels treatments are just forest management. Now, I don't want to bore you too much with, you know, the process that all of us have to go through, but I do want to indicate that there has to be a process for fuels treatment, and the process has to begin with knowledge of the resource. You know, what are we dealing with, and how are we going to deal with it in a multiple objective format? What are our alternatives? How do we evaluate those alternatives, and then monitoring the results? And many of you, I'm sure, are involved in this process or in various parts of the process. Wayne Spencer has joined us, and you know, he's a scientist who's involved in monitoring what happens during fuels treatments. Others of us are involved in the implementation, actually doing it on the ground. But we have to think of this as the context of a process, and the process occurs not just at the project level, but at the landscape level. So where and when do regulations apply? And we're not going to go into this in any detail, but we just, you know, want to suggest that fuels treatments, like any other forest management activity, are subject to regulatory requirements. And if they're commercial harvests on private land, they're subject to the Forest Practice Act. If there's state or federal funding involved, then it invokes regulatory requirements. If there's sensitive biological resources, other land use entitlements, if there's projects that involve land development, and sometimes you'll see, for example, on subdivisions, there are requirements for fuels treatments to reduce fuel loads before the subdivision can be approved. So there's some examples of projects that are subject to regulatory requirements. Prop 40 projects that are funded by CAL FIRE, EQIP projects that are funded by NRCS, anything happening on federal lands, any activities affecting T&E species, and activities within stream channels or wetlands. So the key considerations, if you want to attempt to minimize the regulatory impacts on your projects, are to try to avoid sensitive resources rather than try to mitigate the impacts. Mitigate means cut off because you know something's going to happen. If you can avoid, that's another form of mitigation which is far superior in my view. So, but to avoid, you need to know where things are. So where is the sensitive species? Where are the resources that have to be known about? Timing can be just as important as where the treatments occur, and Lorna will emphasize this, I think, in her presentation. We're planning things at the project scale in areas like this or wherever they are, but we need to view them in a landscape context and what we can do on our properties or what we can do on properties through the vehicle of, say, a community wildfire protection plan depends on what's around us. And this also applies to habitat considerations at the landscape scale. If we're dealing with areas like this versus areas like that versus areas like that, then they all have different implications in terms of habitat. I'll pause now and see if anybody's got any questions, and then I just really want to just put us all on the same page relative to what we're talking about in terms of fuels treatments. Just a little bit of background on me and where I'm coming from on this. I've spent quite a bit of time, not just in education on this, but actually in the practical applications, primarily working in Placer County on fuel management guidelines for their conservation reserves. And in looking at conservation reserves, which in this case are required for the conservation of listed species, listed wildlife and plant species, that's why they're required. There's two issues there. One is you want to manage them to conserve the species, and you don't want the habitat to go up in smoke. Beyond that, you also have the issue that conservation reserves may be nested within areas of private land. You don't want a fire starting on a conservation reserve spreading to a private property. So we, as part of the pending draft HCP, NCCP for Placer County, Western Placer County, I developed a fuel management guidelines for conservation reserves that they have and that they also will be acquiring. So that's part of where I'm coming from. Also, we do a lot of teaching on this, and issues such as defensible space always come to the fore. So, you know, we're dealing with shaded fuel breaks, defensible space, general forest treatments, and then the special conditions of riparian zones and wetlands, and that's what I want to talk about. These are where the treatments are occurring. So fuel breaks, we more or less know what they are, I think. Shaded fuel breaks are kind of in vogue as opposed to completely open, cleared fuel breaks, which were common, especially in Southern California in the past. This is Angora, fuel break next to a neighborhood in Angora that actually was effective in protecting a neighborhood. This is a fuel break in Oak Woodland on a conservation reserve parkland in Placer County. Here is a fuel break, if you will, in a plantation. The goals of fuel breaks are to interrupt fire spread, change behavior, and provide a staging area to fight the fire. It's really critical to understand that a firefighter views these as places where they can make a stand. So, you know, you have to interrupt the behavior of the fire in order for them to be able to make that stand. Fuel break positioning, this is Grizzly Flat, El Dorado County, encircling and defending the neighborhood along ridge lines and roads and at land use boundaries. The width of these things varies from 100 feet, 200 feet on either side of a ridge or a break and slope, maybe up to a quarter mile. Some guidelines for fuel break that, we're trying to encourage, where it's consistent with safety concerns, retain snacks, particularly large ones. And I'm sure we'll have some discussion about this as we go along through this series. Avoid the introduction of exotic plants, particularly hitchhikers on equipment. If a piece of equipment has been working someplace clearing exotic plants and then comes unwashed or uncleaned to your site, it could introduce those plants to your site. Where feasible, allow patches of shrub cover and smaller trees to remain and separate these from each other and from tree canopy. Consider future stand conditions and composition when you're marking trees to remove. In other words, removing an entire cohort of species from a stand is not only going to reduce wildlife habitat values, it's also going to determine what the future stand conditions are. So you need to consider that if you want to maintain particular species in your stand. Defensible space. Some of you are probably involved in implementing that. The goals are to reduce the probability of house ignition and create a safe area for firefighters to work. The before and after. Now, more and more, we come to understand that the condition of the house and susceptibility of the house, the flammability of the house, may be equally important to the vegetation. I've seen lots of pictures of house-to-house ignitions with vegetation remaining. We even saw that in Angora. A lot of the ignitions in Angora, on the Angora fire in the Tahoe Basin, were house-to-house. Guidelines for defensible space. There's a great handbook that's on the Board of Forestry website that provides some guidelines for creating defensible space. Total clearing is neither necessary nor desirable. And in wildland areas, you'd want to try to avoid planting exotic plants. Consider wildlife enhancements. Lots of things can be done right around your house to try to enhance wildlife habitat values. We're not going to talk much about defensible space. That's certainly a regulated area, and we're primarily concentrating on project level and landscape level treatments. So we have general forest treatments too, and these are pictures from studies that Mike Taylor-Stowe has been doing. The goal for these general forest treatments is to reduce the likelihood of crown fire under moderate weather conditions, and this often involves thinning from below to reduce the density in the overstocked stands. Most of the people that I know would tend to agree that overstocking, particularly in mixed conifer stands, is a main reason why we have high probability of severe fires. So, that's what we're trying to do there, is to reduce the understory. Commonly includes a reduction in surface fuels through the use of masticators, if it's level ground, and or prescribed fire, broadcast burn, pile and burn. So you can see when you change this to this, there's going to be obvious changes in habitat. Is there something in between these two which represents a balancing of objectives? Here's another one. Thinning in young, mature stands can reduce the fire hazard, and it can also improve forest health and increase tree growth. So you can achieve increases in productivity, and you can reduce susceptibility to disease and insect attack. But overly zealous general forest treatments can have adverse impacts on habitat, mainly by removing structural elements and by removing entire size classes and species. Potential impacts include removal of critical habitat components, snags, hardwoods, shrubs, simplification of stand structure, turning a multi-storied stand into a single-storied stand. Maybe impairment of understory regeneration because the land gets worked over by machinery and gets compacted. You might have overly deep piles of chips from mastication, and you get wildlife displacement and mortality. There's some guidelines that, again, we sort of generally try to promote, implementing what we would call a variable thinning regime, creating a mosaic of different stand ages and densities, avoiding diameter limit thinning. In other words, prescriptions that say take everything out under 8 inches, are to be avoided because you want to try to maintain a mosaic of stand ages and densities if possible. They need to be separated from each other, but that's not impossible. Retain all the habitat components while reducing the fuel's connectivity. It's the connectivity you're trying to interrupt. You don't want fires to spread from one habitat component to another. And then time treatments to avoid impacts on sensitive species. And again, Lorna will talk a lot about that in our next presentation. For riparian zones and wetlands, my research over decades really has been on riparian functions. And I know right after the Angora fire, and we're looking here at Angora Creek, there was quite a stir about the Angora overstocking in the Angora riparian zone contributing to the spread of that fire. One would have to take a look at what the weather conditions were in that fire to really sort of understand why it got so far so fast. But I can tell you one thing, the groundwater conditions along Angora Creek were such that a lot of the riparian zone along Angora Creek consisted of lodgepole pines, as opposed to the more the species that have more higher moisture content, such as willows and alders and such. So if you look at this slide over here, you can see this is a very severe fire. And where do we have vegetation left? Along the stream valleys. Okay? So I think most of us who have been looking at these over many years would say the riparian zones aren't especially prone to wildfire, severe fire, under moderate weather conditions unless they've been degraded. They've been invaded by upland species or exotics, tree of heaven or, giant reed or some of these other species that are more flammable than the natural riparian species. Or the streams have been affected by reduced flows in groundwater, so they're drier than they would have been naturally, and so they're more susceptible to wildfire. Generally, when a fire comes into a riparian zone, it has a patchy impact. It doesn't result in a stand replacement. So for riparian zones, the general guidelines, avoid the bed and banks of streams. Not only will you avoid impacting the stream in the riparian zone, you'll avoid invoking the wrath of the Department of Fish and Game and 1603 permits. Provide buffers and focus the treatments at the interface between the riparian wetland areas and the uplands. In other words, this is where the fire is probably going to come this way. And if you can interrupt the spread of the fire into the riparian zone by treating that interface, reducing fuels in that interface, then that's a good thing in my view. Then you can go inside the riparian zone and thin to reduce ladder fuels, but try to maintain habitat diversity. Again, recall that if the site is occupied by the natural riparian community, it's going to be higher in moisture content and it's going to retain more moisture later into the season than in an upland condition. So some conclusions of my talk, and again, I'm just trying to set the stage for all the things that are going to follow. Forest management can achieve forest health and risk reduction while minimizing impacts. You have to have inventory information. Got to know what's out there. not just what the fuel loads are, but what the species are and what kinds of habitats they're occupying. One size fits all doesn't do the job. It may be easy to implement or to explain, but the results aren't necessarily going to achieve multiple objectives. And your treatments do need to address long-term stand conditions. That concludes my presentation.